So, Sasha and Max, can you please present your analysis on risk assessment for community staking?
Yep, sure. Hey everyone, I'm Sasha, a Lido contributor working on the community staking workstream as a product manager. The second section of our today's call is supposed to be about the permissionless bond analysis. But firstly, it's worth providing a bit more context why we're going to talk about such kind of things. So, several months ago, we have presented the Community Validation Manifesto, where the Lido contributors gathered a common understanding of why solo staking matters and what we want to achieve as Lido contributors on our way of evolving the Lido node operator and validator set. Within these goals, outlined in this document, we have committed to increase the number of independent node operators and to lower the barriers to becoming a node operator. Since those days, when we established this manifesto, a lot of work has been done. And the most significant milestone was the deployment of the staking router smart contract, which basically opens up the opportunity to modularize the Lido validator set. And it means that the Lido DAO can switch from the monolithic node operator set structure to the modular one. So that's why we started working on the development of different modules, which aim to onboard new node operators. But if we do a step back and look at these goals once again, we can see that there is a small note that these goals must be achieved without compromising on quality. And it means that while increasing the number of independent node operators, we must always think about risks and implement such mechanisms of risk mitigation that remain the overall protocol stable and secure. And I myself can say that it requires a lot of effort. So bonds and DVT are considered as crucial risk mitigation mechanisms in permissionless staking solution. They can be combined in various ways within different modules. For instance, a module might utilize the bonds without DVT, or it can be a combination of bonds and DVT, or whatever. And the most interesting fact about bonds is that the required amount of bond should be enough to cover the risks for the Lido stakers. And in the same time, it should be affordable for node operators, because we remember that our another goal is to lower barriers to become a node operator. And how to reach this balance? So that's the question that Max is going to talk about. Yeah, Max, the turn is yours.
Thank you, Sasha. Yeah, hey, my name is Max. I'm also a contributor, part of Analytical Stream. And with this explanatory talk about what we're going to do, we're going to dive into some details about the mechanisms of the first thing is evaluating risks involved in running a validator and ways to mitigate it. Of course, there are multiple ways to mitigate it, and we're focusing specifically on bond within this talk. I will be talking about risks, and mainly about risks involved with validator malfunction, whether it's going offline or slashing, or the risks of EL reward stealing by malicious actor rerouting the EL rewards to different addresses. Of course, all of these risks could happen unintentionally or intentionally, and all of these risks should be mitigated to facilitate all the needs and all stakeholders' expectations, not in terms just the NO community, but also stakers and DAO. And there are different ways of mitigation, of risk mitigation, like bonding or reputation-based mechanism, or explicitly reducing risks with DVT. But for all of this, the first things we need to handle is the way to evaluate risks, and then try to build a mechanism that would reduce the risk exposure of our protocol. So the agenda is pretty simple. We would go by each of these risks provided here. talk about how we can validate the effect, how bond can mitigate the effect, and then talk a little about the complex risk of these damaging events realizing at the same time or consequently. The couple of words on assumptions. So to model the risks and damage and the valuation, we need some assumptions on mechanics, which is basically that the node operator fully controls validator behavior, and all the rewards and validator balance after exiting would end up on the protocol vault. And we need a crucial assumption that at some point in the future, there would be technology providing smart contract triggerable exits, which is more of a reality now, but still not within the spec. And also, to provide risk valuation, we need to make some assumptions on the market, which is basically what situations or scenarios we are considering in terms of the damage to the protocol. During the whole this presentation, we will be using risk averse approach, which is basically could be formulated as taking numbers representing as much damage as possible. And for market assumptions, the most crucial parts are the level of CL rewards and the level of EL rewards, which we're taking to some generous numbers, and also EL reward structure, which impacts the amount of risk damage that could be provided. And for our approach, we used the assumption on consistent nature of the EL reward structures in terms of distribution and median values. Going straightforward to the risks provided above, the first in validator going offline for some time. There is some assumptions should be made. The period of offline, the APR on consensus layer, and NPR on execution layer. And basically what we are presenting right now is a framework that can put these assumptions to the numbers of possible effect on the protocol. For validator going offline, there is a part of missed rewards, the rewards that the validator didn't get for this time, and it's basically a validator balance multiplied by period, multiplied by APR on CL on EL, and penalties that is accumulated on this level, which could be measured as missed rewards on consensus layer multiplied by 3/4. The gist behind this coefficient is the structure of penalties. They are going for sync committed, not going for proposal, not for all the attestations. More precise number giving the whole spec is 65%, but adding up a little bit more on this is based on the risk averse approach, with penalties, for example, for sync committed being like exactly the same as missed rewards. Applying this pretty basic calculation, we could end up with some amount of ETH that protocol didn't get as a result of this risk realization. This is important to mention, as the penalties is straightforward decreasing the amount of ETH within the protocol and validators, and missed rewards is something that didn't landed, comparing with situation when validator ran as usual. And transferring this risk is another option. It could be compensated by the bond as a whole. It could be compensated by the bond, for example, on the penalties part, and for missed rewards could be shared between all the participants. Again, this is the framework just to assess the numbers. The decisions on how this risk will be transferred or handled is the next step on this research. But getting the number is a crucial part to this. For the slashing thing, the situation is a little bit more complicated. Again, we need some assumptions. For this, it's exit period for the validators getting slashed. We don't need forced exits here, as it would be exited by the beacon chain itself, but it could be a line, a queue on exits that will lengthen the time that it would be not generating rewards and getting penalties. Also, some assumptions on APR. The logic on missed rewards is basically the same with the different exit period. The logic on penalties is quite simple. There is initial penalty, there is attestation penalties for being offline during the validator exit. Never mind, it's offline and not, it would still get the penalties. And midterm or correlation penalty is a little bit trickier. There is a formula here, but the basic logic behind this formula is again simple. For each 1% of network slashing at the time of midterm penalties, 3% of validator balance would be slashed as correlation penalty within the integer mathematics behind that means rounding down to nearest integer. The idea here is, as a correlation penalty, you can get as high as possible in terms of the validator rewards, but building additional assumption on the amount of network that is slashing at this moment, we could limit this risk. For example, if no more than 3.13% of network is in ongoing slashing, the correlation penalty wouldn't exceed 2 ETH because of this math with multiplied by 3. So the framework here adds additional assumption on which risks in terms of the ongoing slashings within the network we are trying to protect for, and we are trying to transfer the risk on the bond. And for this particular example, this would be 3.79 ETH. So the recap on assessment of first two types of risk is pretty simple. There is some assumptions that should be made that outside of the framework. That is a question of what risks we are trying to prevent and what risks we would take if this happened. Then there is an assessment part when we could calculate based on the assumptions the level of exposure to risk. And then there is an application. For example, this is the thing I've told before, with a pretty generous level of sale rewards and EL rewards, with an assumption that there would be no more than a year, at least, the technology for triggerable exits, that there wouldn't be an activity leak for substantial amount of time, and that we are not protecting from the case of more than 3.13% of network slashing within the same period. 4 ETH bond is enough to compensate the risk of going offline and slashing basically for any amount of validators. Going next for the third type of risk, which is quite interesting in terms of this approach, the possibility for changing recipient address and basically stealing yearly rewards brings up a tough question. First of all, and the major difference is YL stealing is directly incentivized. If you are trying to slash your validator or going offline, you don't get the rewards. It's basically rewards missing and damaging the ETH. For this situation, YL stealing is an opportunity for malicious actor to perform this attack and gets more rewards that he's risking. And due to high variance in the amount of YL rewards, basically no amount of bond as a mechanism could prevent this situation purely on economical sense if we're speaking about entity controlling only one validator and providing only one bond. As like if we have the block worth 400 ETH, like node 4, node 16, node 32 bond would economically prevent the actor from stealing it and losing its bond. But the good news are pretty simple, which could be formulated like that. There is very, 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 very small amount of blocks that worth so much ETH. For example, only 0.28% of the blocks worth more than 4 ETH. And if we assume the worst case scenario, when all the actors act maliciously and steal them, the amount of blocks subjected to this attack is pretty low, but the amount of cumulative EL rewards is pretty high. If this 0.25 of blocks would be stolen, we would lose as a protocol basically 25.8% of all EL rewards, which would be socialized on all the stakers. So we couldn't, with no amount of bond, prevent this situation, but we could limit it. And the basic idea is the more bond we have, the less effect on EL rewards, supposing that all of the actors would be acting purely economically malicious, stealing the bond, stealing the EL if they face the block that was more value than bond they provided. It could be combined with this within this graph, which is basically the more bond you have, the less decrease in EL rewards we would observe in this situation. But there is a significant element of chance within this model that is inherited from that significant variance of EL. The basic gist here is simple. What if we would face more high-worthy in terms of EL blocks through the year, and hence more intentions for actors to steal the bond? For this case, the approach could be transformed a little, basically adding multiple dimensions of simulations and selecting some quantile, again using the risk-averse approach, in which we get the worst luck in terms of 90% of confidence interval. We get the worst luck on actor behavior in terms of everybody who can steal economically, who can steal getting more ETH than the bond provided would do this, and create this basic curve which transforms to which amount of EL rewards would be stolen for different levels of bond. This is again a framework that could be used to assess the impact of this attack existing on the protocol. And elaborating a little bit on this, we can challenge the last assumption of percentage of node operators or validators that are subject to stealing. In terms of community staking, we're not going in with distributing all of 100% of stake on permissionless node operators. So applying the curve above to the percentage of node operators that are considered subjected to stealing, we could calculate the most possible amount of impact on protocol in terms of drop in APR and in terms of relative drop in APR, within an assumption on which part of the whole APR EL rewards are providing for. Again, using risk-averse approach, the more EL rewards are responsible for APR, the more prone we are to this attack, as it affects only EL rewards. Basically, this is a framework to evaluate this, and the case for using it is making some assumptions on the EL rewards structure, on share of validators that are subject to stealing, and level of risk tolerance in terms of confidence interval, using risk assessment, and evaluating which risks the DAO and the stakers and the community is okay to take if we don't have any additional mechanisms apart from bond, which is of course not true, as bonding is not the only one mechanism. And yeah, the example here is based on the graphs above. For ETH bond, decrease in APR would be less than 0.027% with probability of 90% if only 5% of validators would perform ETH attack if opportunity occurs. So at this point, we've built the framework for evaluating 3 types of risks in terms of impact on protocol and in terms of how bond could prevent it or limit at least. But bringing this to meatspace and evaluating a little bit more, these risks could happen at some time, at the same time. So we should consider combining the risk scenarios and evaluating what would happen in this situation. And the basic gist is you can't steal EL if your validator is not running online. And validator being offline is worse than EL stealing on general level, because impactful EL stealing is really rare, and validator going offline is rewards not generated and penalties acquiring for the whole amount of time. So creating this, the most dangerous scenario, is the simple idea. Permissionless join, going offline until the time triggerable exits are arrived, and slashing at the moment they are just around the corner. So again, this is a framework that could provide you the instruments for evaluating this type of combined risks. And the first one is apocalyptic scenario, when all of the risks are going together with risk-averse approach on each of the assumptions. It's again assumptions on IPR, on time to triggerable exits, on the possible level of ongoing sessions, and times in exit queue, and the validators that are affected. With different levels of bond, we could receive the situations when the bond covers all of this damage, for example, 7 ETH for this, or the situation when bonds don't cover all the damage, and in that case, we face a APR decrease within the missed rewards not compensated with the bonds, which could be treated the same as increasing the fee, just to put the context. Again, this is an instrument that could provide this valuation, but basically this assumption are, as I worded them, apocalyptical. None of them, each of them are really, really rare and with low probability to happen, and happening of all of them at the same time is basically non-existent. Protecting from this type of risk would cost us too much in terms of market affordability. More realistic approach is getting to more realistic amount of APR, getting for more realistic amount of ongoing slashing, which is basically capped at 1%, which is huge. We never faced it in the history. And if ongoing slashing is less than 1%, the correlation penalty is 0 ETH. Adjusting a little bit time and exit queue for validators. And for this situation, the bond would cover all possible the risks. And this assumption on the share affected basically doesn't matter, because if it's 1%, 10%, or 20%, when the bond as a mechanism of risk transferring cover all the losses, there is no impact on protocol. There are multiple different scenarios with tweaking some parts. For example, if triggerable exits would come out only in 3 years and it's really impactful, or when the midterm penalty would actually appear, for example, some SIS, if we want to protect from some civil attack. Even we could consider this effect if we go with a zero bond, because again, it's a framework, a tool to evaluate the risk. But I'll move to conclusion that is pretty simple. Risk assessment is a framework, a tool that could be provided to evaluate the different scenarios, and then the decision should be made not on the amount of bond of we should provide in terms of risks, but in terms of scenarios and actual risks that we as a DAO want to mitigate, and which are we willing to take because consider them non-existent in terms of probability. And of course, I'll say it again, the bond is just one of the multiple options that could be used to mitigate the risks analyzed within this framework. And thank you. If any questions in the chat somewhere else, I would love to answer them.
Thanks for the presentation, Max. I don't see any questions in the chat. I have a couple that I'll try to go through quickly, but also in the interest of time, maybe we don't spend too much time on this, but looking forward to like seeing this fully fleshed out and posted perhaps on the forum so that people can like dig into the math and maybe ask specific questions when that's available. So one of the questions that I have, and actually I think like Dimitri brought this up in the Zoom call, and maybe Dimitri even wants to talk about this himself. I'm gonna wait to see if he's gonna unmute or not. No? Oh,
yeah, no,
yeah, he
but,
does. Right.
yeah, here I am. So the important addition here is that the risk assessment is done in the assumption that each validator has its own bond, and there is no connection between validators. But the actual situation in most of the times is that one operator runs multiple validators. And if we're speaking about MEV stealing, one way to mitigate risks even better with keeping the same for ETH bond is to associate the bond not with the validator, but with the all validators of the node operator, and then make this combined bond a subject of a penalty application in case of huge MEV stealing. In this case, we are like assuming that the node operator has, let's say, 10 validators, we will have 40 ETH bond. And in this case covers like literally 99.9% of the scenarios. Yeah, so that's my addition here.
Yeah, absolutely true. And like you're completely true. One side I would add a bit, like piling up together all the bonds, not only the way for DAO to like build new level of risk protection, but also could be used to lower the entry limit, because if the DAO is more protected against the risks, with some technology like piling up different bonds for node operator, we can lower the bond per one validator, because we could like share some of this risk premium of doing this, requiring less capital to for protection of the stakers. So it's technology that's good for everyone, basically.
Yeah. So Torsten, in response to your point, Dimitri brings up a good point, which is where if there's a node operator who is likely to steal, or like it's within their game theory strategy to potentially steal, why don't they just Sybil, i.e. pretend to be multiple node operators instead of being truthful, let's say, and grouping all of their validators under one entity.
For sure.
Yeah,
and that's I'm sorry, and that's the point like I was talking about. If we have an incentive for the node operator to like show that he have 10 validators of 100 and could provide the bond in one pool that could be used for protection, we could lower the bond to incentivize this like kind of, I wouldn't say good, this risk-based behavior when there is no like intention for attack. And if there is an intention for attack, of course, it could be like one entity controlling 100 validators pretending to be 100 solo stakers. But for this situation, the bond would be higher, and different technologies, not in terms of bonding, could be applied to provide some incentivization against that behavior.
Yeah, I think that nails it. And there's a bit of a difference of approach, I guess, that we're exploring. Like, do we do nonlinear bonding, or do we offer some sort of like performance bonus, let's say, if you've been successfully running validators for a large amount of validators, and large doesn't need to be hundreds, right? If you're a solo staker, it might be low tens or something like that, to incentivize operators to self-group, let's say, their validators. Yeah, definitely more carrot than stick, as Torsten says. So there's another comment in the chat, and this is the last one, and then we'll move on to Lucas and Nethermind. Large MEV profit isn't necessarily going to be captured by node operators in that sense. If the MEV takeaway is large enough that the attacker will set up their own validator set. So that's potentially true. So it's very possible that modules that allow for permissionless entry into Lido will basically may potentially be used by these actors, right, to increase their chances of landing a proposal. But that's why, in theory, you need at least a decent amount of bond to begin with. And it's also why the permissionless entry into the Lido operator sets is envisaged to occur through multiple channels and not just like a pure play solo staking module. So in DVT, depending on how you do cluster selection, it may be a little bit more difficult to get complete sibling, let's say, of the cluster, such that the operator could maliciously take over the proposals. Yeah, the reason really, sorry, there's a question. If you think about why risk hacking or getting front run, ensure no leakage or detection outside of Lido, indeed, really like the only thing at risk there is the non-productiveness of that ETH that's sitting in the queue while you're setting up the validators, or while it's getting exited when you want to wind down the validator operation, because like nobody's going to trust you with a block going forward. But yeah, that's correct. But yeah, guys, keep up the questions. Feel free to throw them in the chat and we'll send them to Max. When the presentation and the analysis is available on the forums, we'll welcome diving into this in depth because there's still a lot of meat to uncover.
Yeah, thank you for question. Yeah, easy. You mentioned that we're planning to publish this research on the forum with the base method behind, and all the comments, all the ideas is very, very welcome. Thank you.